We're continuing our work on different types of loops in Java. And once again, there are three different types. There's a while loop, a do-while loop, and a for loop. And in this video, we're going to look at a do-while loop. We're going to spend this time comparing the differences between while loops and do-while loops. So I'm making the assumption that you have already watched the video on while loops and that you've got at least a basic grasp of how those work. Otherwise, I think this video might not make quite as much sense, so I would encourage you to stop here and watch that if you haven't done so yet. And to jump right in, what we're going to remind you is that when we talk about while loops and the sort of flow chart of how they work, the basic process is that we check a Boolean expression. If that expression comes back true, then we're going to jump down and run a block of code. And once we're done with that block of code, we will go back to the Boolean expression and start again. We'll check, and if it comes back true, we'll execute or iterate again. Once that Boolean expression returns false, then the loop is done and we continue on with the rest of the program. So we can describe that as kind of checking first and then running. A do-while loop in Java gives us the option of doing those in reverse order. In other words, we're going to run the block of code first, and then at the end of that, we're going to check a Boolean expression and see if that comes back true, then we're going to jump back up and run the block of code again. So that may sound like a little bit of a subtle difference, but it's the difference between a loop that has to run at least once every time. That's what if we don't check until after we've executed, after we've iterated one time, then we're guaranteed to run the loop at least one time. Sometimes that's good, and sometimes that's not exactly what we want. So let's go ahead and jump into Java and take a look at how this works. We will begin with the same basic example that we used when we started with the while loop, which is this idea of, you can think of it almost like a password, right? We're trying to get the right information typed in. In our case, we're asking what is the best community college in Arizona, and we are expecting the user to type EMCC. Our basic program just does that, but what we want to modify it to do is keep asking until they get the correct answer. The difference is this time we'll use a do-while loop, and you'll see that this is an example where a do-while loop is probably a better choice. So we have our, I can just cut and paste these here, save myself some typing. We have our control variable, which is going to be response, and I have initialized it here. Now we're going to set up our loop, and it's the next thing we think about is how do we check the Boolean expression. The difference here is that we're going to check that after we do our ask of the user. So the way we write that syntax is we're going to use the word do, and then we're going to open a code block, and I'm going to end the code block right there, and we'll then add our Boolean expression, still using the while keyword. So do all of that while it's not true that the response dot equals. Don't really want that extra space in there, but for clarity as I'm typing, I think Visual Studio will clean that up for me anyway. But while it's not the case that response is equal to the answer, in other words, do this as long as the answer is not correct. Let me save that and clean it up. So this essentially is our check of our Boolean expression. I'll just tack that on at the end there. And in this case, we've also already taken care of updating our control variable, because when we ask for that response, that is our control variable. So now we've got this nice compact loop. Remember, in the while loop, we had to ask them first, then we started our loop, and inside the loop, we asked again, essentially, if they got it wrong. So we're saving ourselves just a little bit of work. Let's run this and see if I've done this correctly before I get too excited about this. Once again, we've got this idea that we are case sensitive, but I'll get it wrong first. What is the best community college in Arizona? I'll type it in lowercase, still wrong. Let's try it uppercase. And that's correct. So just like that, our do while loop now works. And so again, the idea is we're taking that Boolean expression and we're setting it at the end of that block, and then so that the compiler, so the runtime knows what's going on, we're sort of prefixing it with the keyword do. And we're saying essentially, if you were to explain this in English or read it out in English, do all of this while this expression is true. And so it reads really nicely as well. That's really all there is to that one. Since that's so easy, I thought we would add on one little piece here just to kind of, as we build on to the way we think about loops and things we can do with our loops. I'm going to keep track of how many guesses it takes. And so this is essentially a counter, right? So I'm going to call this num guesses. And for now, I'll start it out with 0. I'm going to set that to 0. And at the end, when we output that they've got the correct answer, I'm going to say, that's correct. It only took you X number of tries. And I'm also going to slip in one other thing that I'm not going to talk a lot about, but I get tired of the way Java does, using that concatenation, the plus symbol, to keep adding on the stuff to our strings. So I'm going to use a little trick. It's called printf. You can go look that up in W3 Schools or just Google it, Java printf, if you want to see how that works. I'm just going to say it only took you, and now what I can do is I can put essentially a little placeholder there. That percent sign indicates that it's a print placeholder, and then the D represents the data type. And here's where Java always has to be slightly confusing. We think of decimals as data types that have a decimal point in them. When we're formatting strings, decimal is a decimal integer of all things, and so there's a little bit of an inconsistency there. But what this lets us do is it lets us just sort of slip in this placeholder that says, well, we're going to put in a value here from a variable, and then I can use a comma to tack that variable on at the end. And incidentally, I can also use that, I can put a %n, and that's a new line character so that it'll go to the next line after it's done. I don't use printfs very often here. I haven't used it in a while, so there's a good chance I messed that up. Let's go ahead and try it. And then EMCC. Okay, so my printf statement worked, but it still says that the number of guesses is 0. So remember the idea when we have a counter like that, inside the loop, we need to increment that. So I'm going to say num guesses plus plus. And let's try it again. I'll miss it a couple of times here. Okay, so that's clearly not the right answer, but now we'll try EMCC. And so it says that's correct. It only took you 3 tries. And so just another little example of how you can use a counter to keep track of how many times it's iterated or how many guesses they've done or whatever. So that's our first simple example of how to use a do-while loop instead of a while loop. So that was a nice little example of an indefinite loop using the do-while structure, right? An indefinite meaning we don't know how many times it's going to iterate. We don't know how many guesses it's going to take for them to get it right. And so with this example, we're going to add a couple of wrinkles. Most importantly, I want to show a definite loop, right? So in our while loop video, our definite loop was just counting from 1 to 10. And so we're going to add a little twist here where we're going to make that, instead of going from 1 to 10, we're going to go from whatever number a user inputs for the starting point to whatever number they enter as their ending point, because I want to show you that your control variables and what we would call the boundaries of your loop can be determined by variables, right? They can be user input, they can be calculations or whatever. We don't necessarily know as programmers what those numbers are going to be, but it's still a definite loop because because at the time the loop starts running, it's going to know what those values are. We're also going to add one other little piece here just to show you, emphasize some things that you can do with loops that are useful. And that is I want to make sure that the user gives me valid numbers, right? So when the user enters a starting number, the number that they enter for their ending number needs to be greater than that, right? So our program is not going to be set up to work correctly if they type in 5 as their starting number and then negative 200 as their ending number, because our program is going to move up, right? It's going to increment the number in each loop. I could write a loop that would work, I could write a program that would work correctly, but not this one. So what I want to do is, after they have given me a starting number, my ending number, I want to keep asking until they give me a number that is greater than the start. Okay, so we call this, incidentally, we call this input validation. So loops are really useful for this. I'm validating that the value the user gives me will work for what we need to do with it. So I'm going to, once again, start my do, my loop block, I could say here, and I'm going to say while. And my Boolean expression is while the ending number is less than or equal to the starting number, I need to keep asking, right? In other words, I need to keep going until they give me a number that is greater than. So we'll see. And this logic gets confusing even for me, and especially when I'm recording and I'm convinced I'm going to make a little mistake. So let's see if I do this correctly. While the ending is less than or equal to, I call it ending, it's end. It's less than or equal to start. And I think that's the logic I want. So if the, as long as the ending number is too low, we're going to keep asking. The user should know how to use this. I don't need to waste video time making it look pretty. So let's test just that part of it and see if it works, because I'm not convinced I did it right. So enter the starting number. I'll say 4. Now if I put 1, that doesn't work. 2, that doesn't work. Negative 23, that doesn't work. How about 4? That doesn't work either, but 5 should work. Okay, and any number 5 or greater should work. Good. This should also work with negative numbers, by the way. So if my starting number is negative 23 and my ending number is negative 10, that's valid, right? Okay, so that user input validation loop is working now. And I just point that out as a really useful thing to do. Users tend to not do the things that we expect. This doesn't solve all our problems. If the user types in, my example that I always use when I say that, the golden rule of programming is that users are stupid and that they do things we don't expect. So we'll put in 5 here, and guarantee if you ask the user to input an ending number, somebody's going to come along and type in purple. Well, purple doesn't work. That causes our program to crash because we're expecting an integer. We don't yet know how to fix that, which would also be a user input validation issue. We don't know how to fix that yet, but we can at least make sure they give us a number that is valid. Okay, so now that we do have a starting and an ending number that are valid, we can write our definite loop to do that. So let's say do, and what we're going to do is we're going to say system out print line, and we're just going to count, right? So I just need to print out, oh, I need a counter. So I've realized that I need another variable for this. So I like to declare all my variables at the top. Count equals -1. Now we want to print out the count. Okay. Let's not lose sight of the 3 things that we need to keep track of with our loop, or 3 things we need to account for. My control variable now is going to be while the count is less than, we'll start with less than. We're going to figure out if we want less than, equal to, greater than, less than or equal to end, and I think I'm sort of mentally skipping a step that I should pause and talk about for a moment. That count is going to be the number that we output. It really needs to begin with whatever the starting value is, right? Whatever the user typed in for start. So I need to begin by initializing that that control variable here by saying count is going to be equal to whatever they typed in for start. Okay. Now I'm going to print out count. I'm then going to increment count, which is where I'm going to update my Boolean expression, or excuse me, update my control variable. And then checking the Boolean expression with a do while loop happens at the end. And so that's right there. So my logic here is that I'm going to initialize my my counter to, before I might have initialized it to 1, but now I'm initializing it to whatever the user has typed in as the starting number. Okay. Now I'm going to print that out. I'm going to add 1 to it, and if it's still less than end, then we're going to keep going. We're going to keep printing and adding. And so we may have what we would call a bounding error here with our loop. The bounds refer to where a loop starts and where a loop ends. So let's try this and see if we've got that right. I'm just going to put from 5 to 15. Okay, so my beginning number is correct. It starts at 5 and then it adds 1 each time, but we're off by 1 at the end. We shorted it by 1. And this is just like we saw in that previous video. This is because count gets to 14 and then to 15, excuse me. We print 14, we add 1 to it. And so now we say, while 15 is less than 15, and it's not. So we need to probably just add a less than or equal to. Some people, again, as a matter of style or preference, some people also will solve this that way, as long as the count is less than the end plus 1. There's not a functional difference in those two ways. It's kind of whatever makes sense to you. In this case, I feel like that's a little more readable, we would say. It makes a little more sense why we did that. Let's try 23 to 34. And that looks like it works. I'm just going to do one more test of things. I'm going to say -4. If I try and go to -10, it shouldn't work. But if I go to 5, that should work. And so it goes -4, and it counts all the way up to 5. So that one looks like it is correct as well. And so we've demonstrated a couple different things here. We've used an indefinite loop as input validation to make sure they give us some valid input. And then once we have that input, we are creating a definite loop, but we are doing it based on variables instead of what we would call literal numbers, instead of saying, well, the count is less than 10. That's a good place for us to stop. I could, of course, keep on going with all kinds of different examples, but in this case, do-while loops are so similar to while loops that I don't feel like I want to make the video too long. But of course, if you have any questions, please go ahead and reach out and ask.